Today we're going to look at multiplying with integers, and then we're also going to look at multiplying with algebraic expressions and with variables. So, multiplying with integers. The important thing to know is that to decide whether the final answer is going to be negative or positive, you're going to count the number of negatives that are involved. If you multiply with one negative number, one negative integer, the answer is going to be negative. Now, if you remember, we talked about using the commutative property to make mental math easier. So if you look at this, I would probably regroup this and say I'm going to multiply this first because I know that 2 plus 5 is 10. Then it's really easy for me to multiply 9 times 10, which is 90. And then I look back and I count how many of those numbers were negative. There was one negative right here, so I know my answer is going to be a negative 90. So I do the multiplication and then I go back and count the negatives. Okay, here we have, when you multiply with two negatives, the answer is going to be positive. So I think about these two negative signs flying together and becoming a positive sign. So here's the two signs, and they fly together to make a positive. Now again, if I use my commutative property, I look and I know that 8 times 5 is 40. And that makes 40 times 3 really easy because I just go 3 times 4 and then add a 0. Then I go back and count the number of negative signs. There are 2. Those 2 fly together to make a positive, and so it would be a positive 120. When working with multiple factors, one can count the number of negative factors. If the number of negative factors is odd, that means that there is 1 negative, or 3 negatives, or 5 negatives, or 7 negatives, the final answer or the final product is going to be negative. If the number of negative factors, the negative signs, is even, there's 2 or 4, 6, 8, 10 negative signs, then the answer or the product will be positive. So this is our little speed round. I'm going to give you a moment to see if you can do it, and then I'm going to tell you the answer. 3 times 2 is 6. 6 times 8 is 48. There is 1 negative, negative 48. I'm going to do the 6 times 5 first. 6 times 5 is 30. 30 times 4, 3 times 4 is 12. Add a 0. That would be negative 120 because there is 1 negative sign. 2 times 7 is 14. There are 2 negatives that fly together to become positive, so that is a positive 14. 6 times 11 is 66. 2 negatives make a positive, so that's 66. 8 times 3 is 24. 2 negatives make a positive, that is a positive 24. I'm going to do the 2 times 3 first just because I like to. 2 times 3 is 6. 6 times 10 is 60. 2 negatives make a positive, positive 60. 9 times 4 is 36. 1 negative makes it negative, negative 36. 9 times 6 is 54. No negatives, so of course the answer is obviously positive. Now let's look at this with algebraic expressions. Again, we're going to use the commutative property to group things that can be multiplied together. So I look up here, and if you remember, the number in front of a variable is called the coefficient. So we can group the coefficients together. And this is a step you may be doing mentally, but I'm going to be writing them on the board to show you how it works. I'm going to group together the numbers, the coefficients, and then the variables. And now I can do 7 times 4, which is 28. 2 negatives make a positive. That's going to be multiplied times A and times B. These are both different unknown numbers. So I'm just going to say the answer is 28AB, which means 28 times A times b, and the variables we always write in alphabetical order. So it's 28 ab. Let's do our commutative property. I'm thinking negative 9 times 3, and then I have x times x. 9 times 3 is 27 with one negative, so it's negative. Any number times itself, if you had, for example, 5 times 5, that is the same thing as 5 squared. So when we have x times x, we can say x squared, which means x multiplied times itself. So the final answer is negative 27x squared. Now this is the most important part of the lesson. Evaluating with parentheses. Parentheses makes all the difference. Here, because of the parentheses, this reads negative 4 squared, which means you have negative 4 multiplied times itself twice. Now, when multiplying negative 4 times negative 4, we know that 4 times 4 is 16, and those two negatives are going to make a positive. So that one is positive 4, or positive 16. Now this one does not say negative 4 squared because the parentheses are not there. Instead, this one reads the opposite of 4 squared. The exponent is only applied to what is right in front of it unless the parentheses group something together, like in the last one. So this one actually means the opposite of 4 times 4 because it was not in parentheses. It did not group that with the negative sign with the 4. So here, 4 times 4 is 16, but we have one negative sign. So this one is actually negative 16. So you really have to watch your parentheses and understand how it works because it's going to make all of the difference. The parentheses makes all the difference. Here you have xy squared, and we're going to be plugging in numbers. Anytime you plug in numbers, they go in parentheses. So the x is 6. The y is negative 2. I put that in parentheses, y squared. So here we have it in parentheses, so we know that that's negative 2 times negative 2. So what we really have is 6 times negative 2 times negative 2, because this exponent tells us that we have negative 2 twice. 6 times 2, well, let's do the 2 times 2 first. It might be easier for you mentally. 2 times 2 is 4. 4 times 6 is 24. And because there are two negatives, that would be a positive 24. This time, look at the parentheses. It surrounds the x and the y. So when I plug this in, 6, and then the y is negative 2. So all of that was inside the parentheses and then squared. So notice this time within the parentheses you have an operation, you have a multiplication. And according to our order of operations, you always do the multiplication first. So this time you have to get what's inside the parentheses down to one number. And 6 times negative 2 is negative 12, still in parentheses. So we have negative 2 squared, which is the same thing as negative 12 times negative 12. 12 times 12 is 144. Two negatives make a positive, so that would be a positive 144. Okay, 3 squared means that you have 3 multiplied times itself twice, 3 times 3. Then we have negative 2 cubed, or to the third power. That means you have negative 2 3 times. The exponent tells you how many times that number is being used as a factor. Now, I'm going to go ahead and go 3 times 3 is 9. And then 2 times 2 is 4. Times 2 is 8. So this is 8. But there are 3 negatives. So I know that that's a negative. And now I have 9 times negative 8, which is a negative 72. Okay, watch our parentheses here. Okay, I'm going to change my outer parentheses to brackets. Brackets mean the same thing as parentheses. And then A is 5, B was negative 2, and that whole thing is being cubed. Now again, we have an operation with inside of parentheses, so we have to evaluate that first. Remember, parentheses first, then exponents. So 5 times negative 2 is negative 10, and now we have that cubed, which means negative 10 times negative 10 times negative 10. When multiplying with 10, you just count the number of zeros. 1, 2, 3. So I know in my final answer I'm going to have 3 zeros. And 1 times 1 times 1 is 1. I go back and count the negatives. 1, 2, 3. So I know the answer is negative 1,000. Okay, here we have A is 5. Then we have B is negative 2. Notice that when I'm plugging in those numbers, I'm putting them in parentheses. And the B is cubed, so it's negative 2 cubed. Remember, when we plug it in, we plug it into parentheses. That means the same thing as 5 times negative 2 times negative 2 times negative 2. 5 times 2 is 10. 10 times 2 is 20. 20 times 2 is 40. There are 3 negatives. That makes the final answer negative, and it would be negative 40. Okay, so here we have the opposite. See, it's not in parentheses, so it's not negative A. It's the opposite of A. So I'm put the negative sign that I'm going to plug in a number, and when I plug that number and it goes in parentheses, notice that this is on the outside of the parentheses because I had to plug in A, and A is a positive 5, so it goes in the parentheses squared. This does not say negative 5 squared. It says the opposite of 5 squared, which means the opposite of 5 times 5. And we know 5 times 5 is 25. With one negative, it would be a negative 25. Okay, here we have 6. We have negative 2 times 5. I plugged that in. I'm going to change this parentheses to brackets just so you can tell the difference between the parentheses and brackets. Order of operation, we have 6 times negative 10. And that would be negative 60. That is our lesson. Good luck with multiplying with integers.